In the winter of 1932, a man named Harold Bryce stepped off a Greyhound bus in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with exactly $14 in his pocket, a battered leather suitcase held shut with a belt, and a card case stuffed with samples of shoe polish. He had not slept in a real bed in 11 days. He had eaten twice in the last 3. But by Friday of that week, Harold had sold 42 units of shoe polish, traded a handful of product samples for 2 nights of lodging, and talked his way into a dinner invitation at the home of a local merchant who would go on to become his best customer for the next 6 years. Harold was not lucky. Harold was skilled. He was one of thousands of traveling salesmen who crisscrossed Depression-era America living out of a single suitcase, surviving on nothing but nerve, ingenuity, and a set of hard-won tricks that most people today have never heard of. These were men and women who had turned the art of survival into a profession, who had learned to read a town before they entered it, who knew how to stretch $1 into a week and a handshake into a contract. If you think you know what hustle looks like, wait until you hear what these people actually did. And stick around, because number 1 on this list is the trick that Harold himself said saved his life during the coldest winter of 1933. And it has nothing to do with selling. If you are new here, subscribe now so you never miss a piece of history that actually matters. Number 25. The Arrival Ritual. Every experienced traveling salesman of the Depression era had what they called an arrival ritual, a specific sequence of actions performed in the first 30 minutes after stepping into a new town. The ritual was not superstition. It was intelligence gathering. A good salesman would walk the main street twice, once slowly on one side, once briskly on the other. On the first pass, he was reading storefronts, looking for which businesses had fresh paint, and which had peeling signs, which had full window displays, and which had bare shelves. Fresh paint meant the owner still had hope and maybe a few dollars to spend. Peeling signs meant a man who was either too broke or too beaten to bother. On the second pass, he was listening, picking up fragments of conversation, hearing which names came up repeatedly, learning who the influential people were before he ever knocked on a single door. Harold Bryce said he could tell within 20 minutes of arriving in a town whether it was worth spending 3 days there or moving on by the next morning. Number 24. The Laundry Network. Clean clothes were not a luxury for a traveling salesman. They were his entire credibility. You could not sell anything to anyone if you smelled like the road and looked like you had slept in a ditch, which many nights you had. The trick the experienced men passed on to the newcomers was to find the Chinese laundry in every town. And in the 1930s, almost every town of any size had one. These establishments were faster, cheaper, and more discreet than any other option. But the real trick was not just finding the laundry, it was timing. A veteran salesman would drop his shirts and collar on arrival, work his calls in his second-best outfit, and pick up the fresh clothes before his most important meeting of the day. Some men developed ongoing relationships with laundry owners across their regular routes, paying a small retainer to guarantee same-day service and leaving a set of clothes in storage between visits. Number 23. Eating for information. Food was expensive and money was scarce, but the lunch counter at the local diner was not just a place to eat. It was the best intelligence operation in any town. A savvy salesman always ate at the counter, never at a table. The counter seat put you next to locals, next to the cook, next to whoever walked in for a quick cup of coffee. It was where you learned that the hardware store owner had just landed a contract to supply a new construction project, or that the dry goods merchant's daughter was getting married next spring, and he was in a good mood, or that the feed store man had just lost his brother and was not the right moment to approach. 1 plate of beans and a nickel cup of coffee could buy you 3 days' worth of local intelligence if you knew how to listen. Number 22. The sample case system. Every traveling salesman carried samples, but what separated the professionals from the struggling amateurs was how those samples were organized. The master salesmen of the Depression era developed intricate systems for their sample cases, arranging products not by category, but by the type of customer they were walking into. Before a call on a hardware dealer, the case was reorganized so the hardware-adjacent products were on top, visible, accessible. Before a call on a pharmacy, the case told a completely different story. The reorganization took about 4 minutes, and it meant that when the case was opened, The first thing the customer saw was exactly what was most relevant to them. It made the salesman look prepared, thoughtful, and professional, which he was. But it also made the customer feel like this product line had been selected specifically for them. Number 21. The Weather Gambit. Depression-era salesmen knew something that modern sales trainers have largely forgotten. Weather is the great equalizer and the great opener. A man who shows up at your door in a freezing rain gets sympathy. A man who shows up on a beautiful spring day gets distraction. The experienced roadmen learn to time their calls around weather patterns, not to avoid bad weather, but to use it. Arriving soaked to the bone, apologizing briefly, and then getting down to business immediately gave the host a reason to invite you inside, gave you shared suffering to bond over, and created a psychological debt of hospitality that the customer often unconsciously tried to repay by being more receptive to whatever you were showing them. Several old-timers described this as the best trick they ever learned, and the one that no one would ever believe. Number 20. The thank you inflation system. Writing thank you notes was standard practice in business even in the 1930s, but the top traveling salesman had developed what one veteran described to his apprentice as the inflation system. A standard thank you note acknowledged the meeting and the purchase. An inflated thank you note acknowledged the meeting, the purchase, and then specifically mentioned something personal, a piece of information the customer had shared, a problem the salesman was going to follow up on, a family detail that had come up in conversation. The customer who received an inflated thank you note felt that the salesman had been genuinely listening, genuinely engaged, genuinely interested, which he had been because he had been trained to treat every conversation as a deposit into a relationship account that would pay dividends on the next visit. Number 19. The hotel negotiation. A hotel room in 1932 cost anywhere from 50 cents to $2 a night depending on the town, and for a man living on commissions that had been cut 30% from the year before, every night was a negotiation. The professionals had a script they ran at every front desk in every town. They would ask the rate, nod thoughtfully, and then ask if there was a weekly rate, even if they were only staying 3 nights. They would ask if the rate included breakfast. They would ask if there was a commercial traveler's rate, a discount that many hotels still offered because it kept rooms filled during the week. If none of that worked, they would ask to see the room first, and in the room they would find something minor to object to, not aggressively, but professionally, and use that to negotiate a small reduction. The average veteran saved between 30 and 40% on lodging compared to what a civilian would have paid for the same rooms. Number 18. The reference chain. Cold calling was the foundation of the road salesman's work, but cold calling in the Depression was particularly brutal, because every merchant was being hit by 20 salesmen a week, and most of them had a policy of not seeing anyone without an appointment. The trick that separated the men who ate from the men who didn't was the reference chain. Before leaving any successful call, the experienced salesman would ask a simple question. Who else in town do you think might benefit from seeing this line? The merchant would suggest a name. The salesman would write it down, and when he walked through that new door 15 minutes later, the first words out of his mouth were, "Jim Calloway over at the hardware store said I ought to come see you." That sentence unlocked more doors in Depression America than any amount of charm or product quality could have managed on its own. If you have been watching this channel for a while, drop a comment telling me which of these tricks surprises you most. We are just getting started. Number 17. The Suitcase Hotel. On the worst nights, when the hotel was too expensive and the rooming houses were full, the veteran roadmen had a network of solutions that newcomers took months to discover. Railroad stations had waiting rooms that were open all night and were warm. Some churches left their fellowship halls unlocked for travelers. A few towns had actual travelers' shelters run by civic organizations. But the real trick was the relationship with the overnight diner. A salesman who stopped in for coffee at 2 in the morning, bought a piece of pie, and was polite and quiet could often sit in a booth until dawn without being asked to leave. The secret was to never ask permission and never draw attention. To simply be a quiet, paying customer who happened to stay for a very long time. Number 16. The shoe strategy. A traveling salesman's shoes were his most important capital investment. This sounds like an exaggeration until you understand that a roadman might walk 8 to 12 miles in a day between calls, that shoe repair in a strange town was expensive and unreliable, and that walking into a customer's office in deteriorating footwear was a visible, immediate credibility killer. The top men of the Depression era had a two-pair system. One pair was their presentation shoes, polished to perfection, worn only for actual sales calls, and then immediately changed. The second pair was their walking shoes, worn everywhere else, resoled regularly, treated with lanolin to keep the leather from cracking. They stored the presentation shoes wrapped in cloth inside the suitcase, packed in a way that preserved their shape. Harold Bryce said he once turned down a sale because the customer's shoes were catastrophic, and it told him the man could not actually pay, a judgment that turned out to be exactly right. Number 15. The town newspaper trick. Every experienced roadman subscribed to a simple intelligence system, the local weekly newspaper. In towns where he was planning a visit, a good salesman would write ahead to have a copy mailed to his next stop, or he would buy one the moment he arrived and read it cover to cover on the train or bus to the next destination. The weekly paper in a small American town in the 1930s was a complete intelligence briefing. It listed business openings and closings, reported on crop conditions and local economic news, announced weddings and deaths and new births, covered civic organization meetings, and ran letters to the editor that revealed the community's real concerns. A salesman who walked into a meeting having read that week's paper was, without appearing to have done any research at all, extraordinarily well informed about the person sitting across from him. Number 14. The slow close. Depression-era customers were terrified of spending money they didn't have, and a salesman who pushed hard for an immediate decision almost always lost the sale. The veterans had developed what they called the slow close, a technique that sounds almost unbearably patient by modern standards. They would make their presentation, answer all objections, and then, instead of asking for the order, they would say something like, "Why don't you think on it overnight and I'll stop by in the morning before I catch my train?" This did several things simultaneously. It removed pressure, which made the customer relax. It set a deadline, because the salesman was leaving in the morning, and it gave the customer the experience of sleeping on a decision and coming to it himself, which made him feel like the choice was his own. The slow close had a success rate that shocked newcomers when the veterans first described it to them. Number 13. The mending kit diplomacy. Every professional traveling salesman of the era carried a small sewing kit, not for vanity, but for strategy. A loose button reattached, a small tear repaired, a hem that had come undone on a customer's coat noticed and fixed before the customer himself had seen it was the kind of small, unrequested service that created goodwill out of nothing. It also demonstrated a kind of careful attention to detail that subliminally communicated competence. If this man notices that my button is loose and fixes it without being asked, his products are probably well made too. Some of the top men extended this to other small services, sharpening pencils, replacing a burned-out bulb in a shop display, sweeping a bit of debris from a doorway before entering. Acts of unrequested usefulness. Subscribe now, if you are not already, because the tricks coming up are the ones that separated the men who merely survived from the ones who actually built something during the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Number 12. The credit intelligence system. Extending credit was a constant danger for salesmen because a sale on credit that didn't pay was worse than no sale at all. It cost the salesman his commission, and sometimes his own pocket. The roadmen of the Depression era had built an informal intelligence network about credit risk that was extraordinary in its sophistication. They shared information with each other at train stations and in hotel lobbies. A quick exchange of names and judgments. This merchant is good for it. That one has been stringing suppliers along for 6 months. This woman pays on the nail, but that hardware man is a risk. Some of the more organized circuits even had small handwritten ledgers they passed between trusted colleagues, a record of credit experience with specific accounts across a territory. No bank was involved, no formal system, just men who depended on each other's information to survive. Number 11. The one good suit protocol. A Depression-era traveling salesman owned one good suit, possibly two if he was doing well. but one at minimum. And the protocol around that suit was almost ceremonial in its rigor. The suit was brushed every evening with a clothes brush and hung on a proper hanger, never folded into the suitcase. A damp cloth was used regularly to lift impressions from the fabric. The suit was reserved absolutely and entirely for sales calls and for any social situation that might produce a business relationship. It was never worn on trains, never worn for the travel itself, always changed into immediately before a call and changed out of immediately after. The discipline around the suit was not vanity. It was the recognition that the suit was a tool, the most important tool in the kit, and tools that are not maintained do not perform when you need them. Number 10. The Church Directory Gambit. In small-town America in the 1930s, the church directory was a who's who of local social and economic standing. An experienced traveling salesman who arrived in a new town on Saturday would find a way to attend Sunday services, not necessarily out of personal conviction, but as a strategic intelligence and relationship operation. In 1 hour on a Sunday morning, he could meet more relevant people in more relaxed circumstances than he could in 2 days of cold calls. He would see who sat where, who greeted whom with genuine warmth, who was deferred to and who was deferential, which merchant was a deacon and therefore had automatic social credibility with the community. He would introduce himself as a commercial traveler passing through, which was honest, and he would listen to the social architecture of the town being revealed in real time around him. Number 9. The complaint conversion. When a customer had a complaint about a product, an inexperienced salesman ran from it. A veteran ran toward it. The complaint conversion was a deliberate technique for turning a dissatisfied customer into a loyal one by handling the problem with such speed, generosity, and visible concern that the customer emerged from the experience more impressed than if nothing had gone wrong at all. The veteran would absorb the complaint without defensiveness, apologize without making excuses, offer an immediate remedy that slightly exceeded what was fair, and then follow up in writing. A customer who had a problem resolved this way was, in the experience of the roadmen who practiced this technique, almost immune to competing salesmen. He had tested the relationship under pressure and found it solid. That was more valuable than any sales pitch. Number 8. The name card economy. Business cards in the Depression were a significant expense for a man operating on thin margins, and the professionals had developed a highly deliberate system for their use. Cards were not distributed casually. A card was presented only at the conclusion of a call that had gone well, never at the beginning, never as an automatic gesture. This served 2 purposes. First, it made the card feel like something earned rather than something distributed like a flyer, giving it more weight in the customer's mind. Second, it meant the salesman left only with people who were real prospects, which made follow-up more efficient and more personal. Some of the top men had a second, simpler card they used for casual encounters, a name-only card with no company affiliation, which they used to collect names and information without triggering the defensive posture that a full sales card might prompt. Number 7. The multi-night investment. A salesman who spent 1 day in a town was a stranger. A salesman who spent 3 days in a town was starting to become familiar. A salesman who came back every 6 weeks for 2 years was practically a neighbor. The veterans understood that the Depression had not ended the economy. It had just slowed it down and made relationships more important than ever. Because when money was scarce, people spent it with people they trusted. Investing 3 nights in a promising territory instead of 1 was a short-term cost that returned dividends over years. The men who built the most durable businesses during the Depression were almost always the ones who had committed to their territories with a patience and consistency that their competitors couldn't match. Leave a comment below telling me what year you think most of these traveling salesmen were born. I read every comment. Number 6. The reciprocity trigger. One of the most reliable psychological tools in the Depression-era salesman's kit was the small, unrequested gift. Not a bribe and not a sample, something smaller and more personal. A packet of flower seeds for a merchant's wife who had mentioned her garden. A newspaper clipping about a topic the customer had brought up on the last visit. A recipe written out by hand that matched something the customer had mentioned enjoying. These small gifts cost almost nothing in money, but were extraordinarily expensive in the attention and memory they required. They said, "I was thinking of you when I wasn't here." In a world where most transactions were purely transactional, that was a remarkable and disarming thing. The customer who received such a gift almost always felt a pull toward doing business with the giver, not out of obligation but out of something that felt genuinely like friendship. Number 5. The territory map intelligence. The top roadmen did not travel randomly. They had mapped their territories with a precision that would impress a military planner, marking not just the locations of customers but the routes between them, the days and times when key decision-makers were most available, the seasonal rhythms of each business, the crop calendar in farming communities, the school schedule in towns where teachers were significant buyers, the timing of local events that either opened or closed the door on calls. A skilled salesman's territory map was annotated with years of accumulated intelligence. It was his most valuable possession and the one thing he protected most carefully. Several veterans described keeping a second copy hidden separately from the first, in case the suitcase was lost or stolen. Number 4. The boarding house bond. For salesmen who worked the same route regularly, the boarding house was not just accommodation, it was infrastructure. A good relationship with a boarding house proprietor in a key territory was worth more than the room itself. The proprietor knew everyone in town, heard everything, and was often the first to know which businesses were struggling, which were growing, which merchants were unhappy with their current suppliers. A salesman who was genuinely kind to his boarding house host, who paid on time, who was no trouble, who brought small gifts occasionally and remembered the family's names and events, had a local intelligence asset of remarkable value. Some of the top men specifically chose boarding houses over hotels in their key markets, precisely because of the depth of local knowledge that a good relationship with the proprietor provided. Number 3. The train car prospecting. The long hours on trains between territories were not downtime for the serious roadman. They were prospecting time. A skilled salesman who chose his train car deliberately, settled into a seat near men who looked like potential customers or referral sources, opened a newspaper, and waited for the natural rhythms of train conversation to create an opening was engaged in one of the highest value activities of his week. Train conversations had a peculiar intimacy. Two strangers sharing a few hours with no social pressure and no social consequence, and they often went to places that a formal sales call never would. The salesman who came off a train with 2 new contacts, a referral, and intelligence about a market he was about to enter, had not been traveling. He had been working. Number 2. The depression-proof product strategy. The wisest of the Depression-era roadmen had made a deliberate choice about what to sell that insulated them from the worst of the economic catastrophe. They had moved toward products that people bought when things were bad, not just when things were good. Shoe repair supplies, because people fixed shoes instead of buying new ones. Patent medicines and tonics, because the Depression created a market for hope in a bottle. Seeds and basic agricultural supplies, because people were planting kitchen gardens who had never gardened before. Cleaning supplies because people who could not afford new things made intense efforts to maintain what they had. The salesman who had positioned himself in these categories was not immune to the Depression, but he was far less vulnerable to it than the man selling luxury goods or anything that could be classified as optional. And now, number 1. This is the trick that Harold Bryce said saved his life in the winter of 1933, the one he called the most important thing he ever learned on the road, and it has nothing to do with sales technique, product knowledge, territory management, or any of the skills you might expect. In December of 1933, Harold was stranded in a small town in Missouri after his bus broke down in a snowstorm. He had sold very little that week, had less than $4 to his name, and the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The hotels were full of other stranded travelers. Every rooming house he tried had no room. He was standing on the main street at 9 o'clock at night in falling snow, trying to figure out what to do, when he remembered something an old veteran salesman named Roy Fielding had told him 2 years earlier. Roy had said, "When everything is against you, find something you can do for someone else right now without being asked. Do it well. The rest tends to work itself out." Harold saw a drugstore with its lights still on, and the owner inside trying to stack boxes on a high shelf by himself. Harold walked in, introduced himself, and spent 45 minutes helping the man reorganize his stockroom without ever mentioning he needed a place to sleep. At the end of the 45 minutes, when Harold put on his coat to leave, the owner asked where he was staying. Harold told him the truth. The owner called his wife. Harold slept in their spare bedroom. He had dinner with the family. In the morning, the owner's wife made him breakfast and packed him a lunch for the road. And the owner placed an order for 12 units of shoe polish that kept Harold's commission numbers solid through January. Roy Fielding's rule was not a sales trick. It was a philosophy. The traveling salesmen who survived the Depression, not just survived but built something real out of the wreckage of those years, were the ones who understood that the transaction was never the point. The relationship was the point. The sale was just the evidence that the relationship was working. These men lived out of suitcases. They slept in train stations and borrowed boarding house spare rooms. They ate at lunch counters and renegotiated hotel rates and wore one good suit with religious devotion. They built intelligence networks out of weekly newspapers and church directories and boarding house gossip. They converted complaints into loyalty and train rides into prospecting sessions. They gave packets of flower seeds and handwritten recipes and newspaper clippings to people they genuinely liked, not as strategy, but because the genuine liking was real. They had learned, in the hardest school that American commerce ever ran, that in the end, the only real currency is trust, and that trust is built one small, honest act at a time. So here is the challenge I am leaving you with today. Which of these 25 tricks would you actually use? Not in 1932, right now, in your own work and your own life. Because I will tell you something. Most of these are not Depression-era tricks at all. They are human tricks. They worked in 1933, and they work in 2026, and they will work in 2050, because they are built on things about people that do not change. Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I respond when I can. And if you got something out of this video, share it with one person today. Not because it helps the channel, although it does, but because Harold Bryce and Roy Fielding and all the other men who lived out of suitcases and figured these things out the hard way deserve to have their knowledge passed on. They earned it.